Welcome to SpunTales.com, where we spin tales from around the web. This week, we continue the story, The Falling by J.D. Phillips. The Falling is now on Amazon, so check it out. And follow the author on her socials at facebook.com/authorjd or twitter.com/JD_author. Sir? Sir? The sudden click and bang of the bathroom door tore him out of his bliss. Through the haze of steam, he saw two nurses, one just outside the doorway while the other stood waving the steam away from her face directly inside. Both were riddled with such high levels of adrenaline, he felt his own pulse quicken. He'd given both women a bit of a fright when they'd come to do their rounds and found an empty bed. More than that, they were completely misinterpreting a situation. They'd found him on the bathroom floor with the shower running full blast. They assumed he'd fallen and possibly injured himself, but he was actually feeling quite well. Even the nagging, prickly throb beneath his skull had faded away. "I'm okay," he said. "It's hot enough in here to give you a heat stroke," the first nurse said, waving away the steam. "How long have you been in here?" "I don't know," he replied, watching as the steam cupped and rolled over the nurse's head in a series of ethereal waves. "Do you need help up?" she asked. He hadn't any desire to get up or even leave the room for that matter, but he could see the nurses were intent on making him do so one way or another. His feeling of tranquility vanished the near instant the first nurse shut off the water and silently cursed the wet mess he'd made of the room. He should have known people didn't normally use the shower as he had. He should have known the hospital staff would fetch him eventually. The nurses were concerned only about the state of his body. It wasn't on their list to tend to his actual well-being. "Come on, up you get," the first nurse said, moving away from the shower in order to hold out his hand. "You must be burning up." He shook his head. He didn't feel warm, and he didn't want to take her hand, and half turned to use the wall as leverage to get up off of his rear end. It made for a slow process, first onto his knees, and then a half clinging to the trash can to get back on his feet, but he managed it without ever needing the nurse to lay her hands on him. "Good," the first nurse kept saying. Her voice was low and hushed, as if he were a wild animal, and she was worried he might turn on her. "Any dizziness? Any pain? Are you feeling alright?" While there wasn't much to compare things to, it wasn't much worse before, so he shook his head. Then he noticed a frown forming on the woman's brow, thought her words over and over again, and nodded. "No pain, yes, alright. The steam helped my head," he said. The brow frown softened slightly. "I'm glad to hear that, but you shouldn't have gotten out of your bed on your own. Head injuries have to be taken very seriously, you know. What if you'd slipped and hit your head all over again?" He arched his brows curiously. "I don't know. What if?" She stared at him hard and unblinking for a few seconds, and then shook her head. "Are you sure you didn't fall after you turned on the shower?" "I fell before," he said, shivering at the thought. "Before you made it into the bathroom?" the second nurse asked. "Before here." "You mean on the bridge?" the first nurse said. He nodded. "That's what they said." "Lots of folks have fallen off that bridge over the years," the first nurse replied, gesturing for him to walk toward the second. "City likes to blame it on that rock star that made a music video there years ago, showing him falling off of it. Locals like to tell the story too. They really live it up come ghost tour season, with that rocker falling off a building like he did not long after. Bunch of BS if you ask me though. Plenty fell off that bridge before they made the video too. Ain't nothing supernatural about it. Some places call to the lost more loudly than others," he whispered. "Only the lost can hear the screaming." "What's that?" the second nurse asked, her expression tightly drawn. "What?" he countered. He'd voiced the thought so quickly, he honestly wasn't certain where or who it had even come from. Maybe the second nurse, Ruth, according to her name badge, or the first nurse, Maggie's. Maybe it was his own. Regardless of the point of origin, he'd let it in and spoken it out automatically. He had no idea what he'd even said. Ruth didn't like it, that was plain to see, though she was trying hard to behave as if she hadn't heard it clearly enough to judge. He decided it best not to go searching for the words in her thoughts. Chances were, he wouldn't much like what he'd said either. He returned to his bed and laid down just as both nurses wanted. Maggie asked the usual questions all over again about dizziness and pain, and asked them to follow her finger as it moved all about. Easy tests, easy tasks. He felt a sense of satisfaction over having done well despite how simple it seemed, especially when he overheard Maggie's thought that he wasn't totally broken. "All right, dear," she said. "Is there anything we can get you before we go?" "Go?" he asked. "We've got a lot of rounds to do," Maggie said with a nod. "We decided to check on you first since Mira said things were tricky." He didn't understand the tiny prick of guilt running underneath Nurse Maggie's words. Guilt to be leaving so soon. Guilt over not even attempting to obtain his actual blood pressure because she'd heard from the others it wouldn't do any good. "Don't feel bad," he told her, quite glad she wasn't going to put the painful cuff on his arm. "I don't." "Well, good," she said, forcing a smile. "Remember to hit the call button if you need anything. We'll see you in a little bit." Both nurses took their leave immediately after, and he was alone once again. He wanted to go back into the bathroom and fill the air with steam, but he already knew the staff disapproved of that, and disapproval wouldn't help clear the remaining items off Logan Pam's list. No, he needed to do things the right way, the way they wanted, if he stood any chance of getting out of here. Unfortunately, that once again left him with little else to do but sit and stare, and he'd already counted the ceiling tiles before breakfast. He listened as more and more patients in the surrounding rooms began to awake. Some quick to moan in pain while others eager for breakfast. A few remained quiet, sullen, somber. A few were aware they didn't have much more time remaining in this life, and loathed the fact that final moments were being spent here. It was the latter he heard most clearly, for their energies resonated on a level it seemed he was most accustomed to. Regrets over things being done or not done. Sorrow for those lost and soon to be left behind. Anger that life hadn't gone at all as planned, or occasionally because it had. He understood these feelings on a deeper level despite having no recollection of ever having felt them himself, and was for that reason he was able to take comfort in them as he passed the time. Eventually, the emotions shifted. The affected had either fallen asleep or forced to change to appease visitors and staff, and he decided to get up off of his own bed in order to sit and stare at the world beyond through the window directly. Now that the sun had risen, he could see a large portion of the hospital's parking lot down below, as well as a number of trees and a few buildings and houses across the street. Nothing much happened on the residential side of things, but he found the parking lot a near constant source of activity. Cars parked, people climbed out and walked toward the hospital, sometimes laughing, other times near tears. Oftentimes, he noticed drivers returning alone after having to leave their companions behind. Many had yet to return at all. He started counting every person he saw without realizing or even knowing why. 6 women, 7 men, and 3 children had come and gone in the past half hour alone. One woman collapsed into a fit of tears against the side of her car while the man she traveled with gently stroked her back. She'd come too late to say goodbye, and now the past was gnawing more than it had in all of the last several years combined. She wept as much for her loss as for the weight she now knew she'd never be rid of. It was a weight Hartt himself didn't have to carry yet, but he sympathized nonetheless. Having sensed a similar ache in Randall, as well as Officer Patrick. He thought again of how Randall's suggestion that someone would be glad to forget the past hadn't made much sense to him yesterday. But today, he felt he understood it a bit better. He'd been lot watching a long while before his eyes were drawn to an older model truck painted a lovely sky blue. He would have noticed the vehicle regardless due to its unique appearance amongst the rest, but then it parked and the driver's side door opened, and he saw a familiar face emerge. Randall was here. He pressed his hands against the glass and placed his face as close as he was able, staring intently as Randall stood smoking beside his truck. This was not Randy's usual day or shift to work, but after the accident, the hospital needed an extra set of hands. It wasn't the work that made Randall reluctant to enter the building and punch the time clock, however. For a moment, just before Randall tossed the remains of his cigarette on the ground in order to stomp it out, he looked up in Hartt's direction and stared. Randall's gaze remained for mere seconds, but Hartt met it nonetheless. Given the angle and the distance between them, it seemed unlikely that Randy actually saw him looking out, but the visible shudder that seized Randy's shoulders before he hurried inside told him he'd felt Hartt's gaze upon him. He couldn't say exactly why having Randall back in the building filled him with a warm sense of relief. He'd been certain the man had avoided the deadly collision after all, so it wasn't exactly a surprise to see that he'd made the correct call. Still, he'd seen so few familiar faces before he woke up in the cube, he was glad Randall was here. Part of him wanted to ask one of the nurses to take him down below to visit Randall. Not because he had interest in Randy's work exactly, but so he could express said relief. He was also curious to see the other man Rita had mentioned, to take a look at the man's face and see if it struck him as if maybe he'd known him before the fall. He didn't think that an unreasonable request, but then he remembered just how many flashing lights had come and gone the night before, and frowned. They'd brought in more bodies than there were cubes to hold them, and called in Randall because the staff was overburdened. He imagined getting bodies identified and ready for pickup was top priority. Where the bodies went after that, or what happened to the old unidentified bodies taking up space, was a mystery, but instinct warned he only had a narrow window in which to gaze upon the unknown man. He turned away from the window and eyed the remote resting upon the edge of his mattress. The call button was easy to spot from where he stood, but the thought of actually pressing it filled his stomach with an unexpected and most unwelcome fluttering sensation. They didn't want to be bothered. He didn't want anyone to be bothered by him. Slipping out of his room and into the hall beyond unnoticed proved easier than anticipated. He had to maintain focus each step of the way. Right foot forward, down. The left foot forward, down. But he managed to quietly walk his way to the elevator. He glanced over his shoulder toward the nurse's station to see if anyone happened to be watching him, but most of the nurses either had their heads down or were currently on the phone. He looked back at the elevator panel and pressed the down button. When the doors opened, he would get inside and be on his way. Simple, easy. Or so it would have been, if not for his stomach. Whether the food he'd consumed earlier or the thought of getting inside the awful lurching elevator yet again was more to blame. His stomach suddenly cramped with greater intensity. He took a step back and put his hands over his abdomen, as if he could somehow feel what was amiss, and pushed it back into place. He was still holding his stomach when a curious, wheezy groan and cough from one of the nearby rooms got his attention. He saw the deep, dark hovering of a middle-aged woman well before he set foot into the room, and realized she was about to quit her body. As best as he could tell, it was similar to the dark figure he'd seen in the MRI room, but the feel of this one was completely different. Softer. Gentler. Almost as though had come out of a sense of duty rather than desire, and had no choice but to see the matter through to the end. The woman was alone in the room, aside from the dark one. She had planned it that way, waiting until her loved one ventured out to the cafeteria to release that final string holding her together. But now that the unraveling had begun, she deeply regretted her decision. The spiral wasn't as painful as it would have been without the aid of medication, but it was frightening. Fear of the unknown. Regrets of the plans left unfilled. Uncertainty over what her partner would do with his life in the days that followed. Sadness. First and foremost, there was just so much sadness and resentment. She'd been struck by such an illness at such an age, even as the knowledge there was absolute, nothing else she could do to resist brought comfort. He walked up to her bedside without thinking, and stared briefly at the monitors beside her bed. The screen flickered before blinking off into total darkness. The sudden silence almost instantly eased the woman's mind now. She no longer had to hear the irregularity of her pulse echoing back at her. Her eyes fluttered open just enough to allow her to steal a glance at him. She didn't know his face, but she saw something in his eyes, which further set her at ease. She thought he was a sweet-faced angel come to take her away, an idea that confused him considerably, and for more reasons than one, but he offered a slight smile nonetheless. He was happy to allow her to believe what she needed to believe to pass peacefully when there were so many worse things she could assume. He watched as the last breath escaped her lips, fascinated to see the life rise out of her body. The dark one hovered and expanded and enveloped, and then, in a span of a blink, the two disappeared simultaneously, and only the empty husk that had served as the woman's physical presence remained. His hand moved seemingly on its own volition, up toward her lifeless arm. He watched his index finger poke at her hand, then her wrist, pleasantly surprised to find the contact caused him no pain. Likewise, his mind was free of images and feelings even when he dared to place his entire hand on top of hers. It was only living souls inside suits of flesh that invoked painful reactions, he reasoned, and this woman had already crossed well over to the other side. He was fortunate Rita was the first to enter the room and find him standing over the dead woman's body. Or at least that's what Rita had said, as she promptly shooed him out into the hallway and ordered him to remain seated in a nearby chair. He sat just as he'd been told, hands folded in his lap, while Rita and several other staff rushed about the inside of the woman's room, trying to call her back to life. He wanted to tell them the important part of the woman was perfectly well, but much too far away now to reel back into the flesh. But Rita had told him to be still, and he didn't get the sense that the other staff were open to hear about what he had to say anyway. He remained still and quiet instead, listening as Rita and the others worked until a slight blonde-haired man emerged from the elevator, dropped his cup of coffee he'd been holding. The woman's partner had returned. This moment had been a long time coming, but the man wept all the same. He was genuinely grieved, as well as a tad relieved that the struggle was finally over. It had been a similar ordeal to the one Randall had endured, except this man had lacked the courage to bring it to a graceful end, despite often wishing one would occur. He had been ready to let go months ago, but Randall was still holding on. And the staff slowly exited to give him time alone. Only Rita came up to Hartt, her face showing signs of fatigue, as well as regret over what she'd just witnessed. She hadn't been in nursing long enough to feel accustomed to such deaths. Part of her hoped she never would be. "Did you know it was her time?" she asked him. "Is that why you were in there?" "I don't know." Rita sighed. "You do know." "I heard her groan before the dark thing took her away." "Dark thing? You've never seen it?" he asked, his voice scarcely a whisper. Rita shook her head. "I think I'd remember if I had. What do you mean it took her away? Like into heaven or something?" He lowered his eyes toward the floor. "Something," he said. "Have you seen this, dark thing before?" He shook his head. You don't know. I know," she was quick to say, shaking her head. "Why did you leave your room in the first place?" "Randall's here," he replied. "I saw him outside." "And?" "I wanted him to show me the man in the cube," he said. Rita frowned, and then a flash of understanding filled her green eyes. "Oh, you mean the other bridge guy?" He nodded. "I want to see his face. I understand how you feel, but trust me, you do not want to go into the morgue right now," she replied. "They're super slammed trying to identify bodies and contact relatives so we can get the bodies out of the hallway. You don't want to see all that." His expression must have darkened as much as his mood, because she quickly pushed toward the professional smile. "Besides, it's not like he's going anywhere, right? You can always ask to go once things slow down a bit. They'll probably even ask you to if they don't get a lead on who he was in hopes maybe you'll remember something." He couldn't deny the words coming out of Rita's mouth. They made sense. He knew she believed every one to be the truth, but lingering doubt gnawed just beneath his skin, so sharp he had to resist the urge to scratch at himself. The thought of simply turning around and going back to his room made him inexplicably anxious, yet he could see Rita wasn't going to leave him much choice. He would have to do as he was told, or actively resist, and it would be foolish to rally against his only friend here over a mere feeling. Reluctantly, he nodded and agreed to let her walk him down back to his room. He could always inquire about the bridge man again, near the end of her shift, this coming evening. Thank you for listening to SpunTales.com. This was a continuation of the story, The Falling by J.D. Phillips. SpunTales is a Heathen Digital podcast. If you have a podcast or would like to start a podcast on the Heathen Digital Network, send us an email at info@heathendigital.com. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Facebook.com/SpunTales and Twitter.com/SpunTales. Thanks for listening.